Latin American currencies slumped on Monday amid bets that improving US data will push the Federal Reserve to soon cut back monetary stimulus, which had driven demand for emerging market assets. Joining me to discuss sentiment is John Welch. John, Mexican industrial output fell in September by the most in 9 months, casting doubt on the strength of a nascent recovery in Latin America's number 2 economy. With this in mind, as well as renewed taper talk, should investors be poised for outflows to the same extent as just a few months ago?
It's already priced in again, it seems. I think the market is fearing something that's not really something to fear about. Taper just means that they're going to print less money, but they're going to keep printing it, or they're going to keep buying assets. I don't really see why the market is so exercised, but that's fine. It makes an entry point better. In terms of industrial production, Mexico has been affected by 2 things in particular. The first is the subprime crisis that they've suffered since last November. That's hitting construction on the residential side. And then the Peña Nieto administration also has completely underperformed their fiscal targets. They have not spent any money at all, especially on investment. That's starting to gear up, so I'm expecting that part of construction, non-residential construction, to start looking better as we get towards the end of the year. And manufacturing was holding up pretty well until this last month. Why manufacturing fell is a little bit of a mystery. It may have something to do with a pause in the United States or even the shutdown. It's hard to explain exactly why, but we do expect to see better numbers very soon.
Despite a financial markets growth better than Chile and Peru, Brazil's growth versus inflation trade-off is worse than its peers. Now, for a country as diverse as Brazil, this is still seen to some as a disappointment. Is that a fair analysis, do you think?
Well, I'm not disappointed. I'm disappointed for Brazil, but it was exactly what I expected, unfortunately. Now, the first thing, I've been looking at Brazil for 40 years. I have never seen inflation help growth, really. There's a lot of places that I've never seen it anywhere, really, but in Brazil in particular, it's very prejudicial to growth because it makes working capital cost. Usually it shows up in inflation in wages first, and that's really where it's really showing up. And that means that working capital costs go up, and that means that the companies have to borrow more for working capital. So typically inflation causes growth to stall, and that's exactly what's happened here. Second, the inflation rate that we're seeing measured is low, first because they changed the weights. Last year they reduced more volatile prices and increased white collar, so it's lower than it used to be only because of that. And we've seen a number of gimmicks going on where you have the suppression of gasoline prices domestically well below their international equivalents, especially in diesel. We've seen a forced reduction of electricity tariffs by 20%. And this is all bleeding the state of companies. So whatever they're doing on this sort of administrative price front, it's showing up in the fiscal accounts. And, so I expect, they're going to have to make an adjustment, especially in gasoline and diesel. And I'm expecting a further acceleration at the end of the year. The bright spot is that the central bank has been tightening since February. Many people didn't believe them. I did. But still the market is really taxing the credibility of the government. The government does not have much credibility with the market right now.
The real has fallen 3.3% since October the 31st, when the government reported that the budget deficit was the largest in almost 4 years. The central bank has brought forward planned rollovers previously scheduled for December. But how effective do you think this will be, given the suggestion that people are realising the swap rates curve probably priced in too many hikes last week?
Well, it's getting more and more expensive to be long dollar, so at some point that's going to bite. And the central bank is gaining back some of its credibility, and we're starting to see some signs away from these sort of administrative things that inflation might be stabilized. In terms of the real, the swaps really aren't effective. They're effective, it's perfectly sterilized intervention, and sterilized intervention doesn't work in big economies, maybe not even in small, but certainly not in big economies like Brazil. In the past, using swaps has worked because they have so many cash reserves that typically they would complement any intervention with swaps with a spot intervention. Well, that hasn't happened in over a year. They're proud of the fact that they haven't used any cash reserves, but at some point you have to use them if you want your intervention to be credible. And you can see that these swap interventions aren't helping all that much, especially when things, fears of tapering, et cetera, increase. So, I think at some point if there's still upward pressure on the dollar, and inflation certainly is going to follow what the dollar is doing, plus these adjustments. We're going to get more tightening. I think our forecast for the Selic in the first quarter is 11%. We've had this forecast for quite some time. And we do think that at some point, if things get a little bit out of hand, they're going to have to come in spot. When they auction lines, credit lines, it's the same thing as spot. So those will work pretty well, but the swaps don't really do anything.
The Mexican peso is down more than 2% this year, but it is expected to outperform the real over the next 12 months as investors remain optimistic about prospects for economic reforms being pushed through by Congress. But is this going to be enough to support the peso through Fed action? And what is your outlook for the Mexican peso against the Brazilian real?
Yeah, we think the peso should outperform the real at this point. I mean, the real, under normal circumstances, would appreciate when you have looser fiscal policy and tight money, but that tells you that the credibility of this government is quite low, the fact that the dollar has risen so dramatically there, and you get the external accounts. Now, in Mexico, we're quite constructive of the Mexican peso, but because it's so liquid and so linked to the United States, you see any fears of tapering, whatever, reflected in dollar mex, but we still think dollar mex is fair valued somewhere around 12.5. So once we get overpricing of tapering, which I think we are, and then we actually get some tapering, maybe in December, and then the market says, oh, is that all it is? Then I think we're going to have some downside to dollar mex. But we're quite constructive Mexico at this point.
John, it has been lovely to speak to you. Thank you so much for your time. Well, viewers, that's all from me for the moment, but be sure to click back to Dukascopy TV for today's Commodities Corner. Goodbye for now.